Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to have this event today. And as you know, we actually planned, original idea was to have this conference in Tbilisi, but because of pandemic, probably you understand that we were not able to do it. And this is the first event of the series of events, which is actually is a joint project by Georgian Institute of Politics and Heinrich Foundation, and supported actually by Heinrich Foundation. As I understand, this is very timely initiative, because as I see today's event, we had 104 registration. So it means that there's a high interest for this time. Before actually proceed with our agenda and introducing actually our speakers, I would like to hand over to Dr. Stefan Meister, who is the head of the Heinrich Boell Foundation in Tbilisi, and I would ask him if he can say a few words about the project actually, and the main idea of the project, and basically what is our plans regarding to this project. Thank you. Stefan.
Thank you very much, Kornely, and I also would like to welcome you in the name of Heinrich Boell Foundation, which is the Green Political Foundation in Germany, which is active here in the South Caucasus in all 3 countries. I would like to thank GIP for setting up this event and also cooperating with us in this project. And we plan 2 more events on Turkey in the South Caucasus, Turkey in the region. This project has, from my perspective, 3 main goals. The first goal is to strengthen research on foreign policy issues in all 3 South Caucasus countries, and also to improve the quality of research, to support young fellows in their research, and on topics which are relevant in the region, but in my opinion are under-researched and under-discussed also in the academic field. And Turkey is, for me, one key country here in the region which should be more discussed. And the third part is also to strengthen think tanks and the quality of the political discussion and the political discourse in the region. So we have picked up 6 young researchers, each from each country in the region, always 2. They have published, or they are on the way to publish studies or analysis, which will be published or already published on the website of GIP. And you can also read these publications. And here we also, in this seminar, we will discuss some of the topics which we have picked up, and also we choose one of the young fellows who wrote one of the papers. Yeah, just maybe one final sentence. For us, Turkey is a key country in different neighborhoods of the EU, and this is also part of a bigger project of HBS. Where we are cooperating with our Turkey office, our Balkans or Serbia office, and our Russia office and France office to look into different neighborhoods in a French-German tandem with regional offices and experts on Turkey's role, and also with Turkish experts, because we believe that the relationship between Turkey and the EU is very important, and Turkey has an important impact on this neighborhood. And despite the difficulties we have at the moment, I think we need to strengthen research on topic, and we need to stay here also in an academic and expert exchange. So I wish you an interesting seminar. I'm looking by myself also forward to it.
Thank you, Stefan. I would like to introduce today's agenda. As you can see from our program, we have 4 very distinguished speakers. Normally, if we had a real meeting, I would say to my right or to my left, this is and so on and so on. But in this time, probably we have to just follow as it's scheduled. So we will have 4 speakers basically today. Each speaker will speak 10 minutes. So after that, basically, we will have a floor vote and a Q&A where actually attendees will be able to raise their questions. So we will have almost like 40 minutes for Q&A session. Before that, maybe let me introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Mustafa Aydin, who is a professor of international relations at Kadir Has University. Previously, Dr. Aydin was a rector of Kadir Has University, and he was a guest researcher and lecturer in University of Michigan, Harvard Fulbright Fellow, and he was also, participants in Richardson Institute for Peace Studies and EU Institute of Security Studies. He's a member of European Academy of Sciences and Art and Global Relations Forum, European Leadership Network, International Studies Association, Turkish Atlantic Council, and Turkish Political Science Association. Professor Aydin's area of interest includes international politics, foreign policy analysis, and security issues related to Eurasia, Caucasus, and Middle East, as well as Turkish foreign and security policies. I would like to welcome Dr. Aydin. He's a good friend of Caucasus and Georgia, so we have met several times. So I'm really glad that you made it today. Our second speaker is Dr. Hürcan Asli Aksoy. She's actually deputy head of Center for Applied Turkish Studies at German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Previously, she was actually research associate at chair of the Middle East Politics and Society at University of Erlangen-Nuremberg and junior visiting fellow at Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, Austria. She was a PhD candidate and lecturer at the Institute of Political Science at University of Tübingen in 2009-2014. Dr. Aksoy is a recipient of Honorable Mention Award of 2006, Best Dissertation Prize awarded by the Women in Politics section of American Political Science Association. She is the first non-US citizen to be honored in this section. Her areas of expertise include Turkish foreign policy in the region, Turkey and the Middle East, gender politics, and civil society. Welcome, Dr. Aksoy, and I hope we will have more opportunity to engage with you after some time as well in real time, for real meetings. Our third speaker is Dr. Licinia Simao. She is an assistant professor of international relations at School of Economics and senior researcher at Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra. She is also, and we are very proud that she's also a member of our advisory board of Georgian Institute of Politics. Dr. Simao holds PhD in international relations from University of Coimbra. And her thesis was on European neighborhood policy towards South Caucasus. So that was one of the reasons actually why we wanted to invite her for this particular meeting. And currently, Dr. Simao is a coordinator of IR section at the Portuguese Political Science Association and member, her research interests include foreign policy analysis, security, peace, and conflict studies, and policies of state building. Her most recent publication is book chapter titled The South Caucasus and West, From Hegemony to Contestation in the book Ratlichen Book of the Caucasus. And last but not least, we have a pleasure to introduce Dr. Ivanna Machitidze, who was actually one of our fellow of this fellowship of Boell Foundation. Ivanna obtained her MA degree in International Relations and European Studies from Central European University, Hungary, and PhD degree from Donetsk National University, Ukraine, with specialization of comparative political systems. Ivanna is presently Associated Professor of International Relations at the Politics and Diplomacy School of New Vision University. Since January 2019, Dr. Machitidze is accreditation expert of education programs in the field of political science and international relations. Her research interests include regionalism and democratization related issue with focus of Eastern Europe and Russia. I think this is all about the speakers. Before I hand it over to our first speaker, Professor Aydin, I would like to say a few words about the why, and to continue what actually Stefan was saying, that why this kind of meeting is important and why Turkey actually is important for the South Caucasus. As you know, Turkey and South Caucasus had a historically very interlinked history, and each country of the South Caucasus actually has some sort of political, economic, and historical links with Turkey. Of course, after the collapse of Soviet Union, there was the new emerging kind of contacts between three independent countries, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, and Turkey. And I just wanted to say a few words about how Turkey was introduced to Georgia. After the collapse of Soviet Union, as you know, Turkey-Georgian relations was not all the time easy. We had a good relations, as well as sometimes we had some difficulties historically. But during this time, it was very difficult, especially in the 90s, how to formulate the policy, Georgian foreign policy towards Turkey. And this was time when Georgia actually had to come up with a new foreign policy towards its neighbors. And of course, importantly, it was one of the country which was very important for Georgia. It was Turkey. And at that time, I would say it was the West, actually, as particularly United States and European Union, who actually reintroduced the modern Turkey to Georgia, and I would say even in Caucasus. And that time, it actually helped much because, we had this internal debates, what kind of relations we should have actually with Turkey, and probably was the same discussion in some other South Caucasus country. And fortunately, we choose the good neighbor relations with Turkey. And as you know, now Turkey is one of the major trade partners for Georgia, and we have a lot of joint projects, economic and trade. And interestingly, we have one of the good example of the cross-border cooperation between Turkey and Georgia. And the Turkish-Georgian border right now is considered most stable and probably one of the good example of the cross-border cooperation. Actually, I don't know if how many of you know, but after recent agreement between Georgian and Turkish governments, now the Georgian and Turkish citizens, they are able to cross the border with ID only. They don't need even to show the passport. So this is a very important, I would say, example of the cross-border cooperation, which is actually, we wish we could have such examples throughout the old South Caucasus, but unfortunately we have more close borders and protracted conflicts, as you know, in this region. Having said that, Turkey always played an important role in Georgian foreign policy, and especially when Georgians were trying to speak about Europeanization of Georgia, Turkey was actually considered as the role model. But recent changes in Turkish politics and foreign policy actually raise a lot of questions where actually Turkey is heading last decades, and how much is the change, internal change, will replicate to the foreign policy towards the neighbors. So this is just very small kind of intro which I wanted to make, and I would like to hand over now to Professor Aydin with the question how and what extent Turkey's foreign policy approach toward the South Caucasus has changed recent decades. Professor Aydin, floor is yours, and actually I will come up maybe after 8 minutes, and I will warn you that you have 2 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kornely. It's nice to be in Tbilisi, at least in spirit, if not in reality. Looking to Turkey's post-Cold War Caucasus policy, of course, one can distinguish a number of periods, sub-periods, where Turkey's interests have changed. But let me just focus this beginning and then the end. So skipping like 20 years in between. In the post-Cold War environment in general, Turkey's Caucasus policy was linked a number of issues. The issues that I will list but not go into the detail are as such. The first, the Caucasus role of as a buffer between Turkey and Russian Federation. And this was, of course, linked to Turkey's security and its connection with regional conflicts. Second important aspect of Caucasus for Turkey was its location as a gateway between Turkey and Central Asian Turkic Republic. That was also important to create linkages that Turkey never had in history, and also the trade routes without going through Iran or Russian Federation. The third importance was, of course, its link to the Caspian riches. Caucasus initially became important for Turkey because of its ability to connect Turkey to the Caspian region and the possibility of transporting Caspian energy resources through Turkey to Europe. The fourth reason is, which everybody keep repeating, is that Turkey's historical, ethnic, linguistic connections to the region. Of course, when you say all of this in the one sentence, everybody assumes that Turkey has all these connections in all the regional countries, which is not true, of course. And historical experiences of the regional people, the societies and the countries, of course, differ how they connected to Turkey and the Turks. And if you look from the ethnicity perspective or linguistic perspectives, same could also be said. But nevertheless, it was assumed that Turkey has some sort of a linguistic, ethnic, and historical connections to the region. And finally, of course, the economic benefits and political influence Turkey derived from the closer relationship with the Caucasian countries were important when Turkey was devising its policies towards the Caucasus in the post-Cold War environment. All of this was, of course, in a later date, maybe towards the end of 1990s, kind of submerged or merged with Turkey's wider Black Sea policies. So when originally at the beginning of the post-Cold War era, the Caucasus was a region for itself, it's gradually submerged into the wider Black Sea region and Turkey's policies towards this bigger region. However, we all know, and the question is here is the same, that Turkey has been reorienting its foreign policy. In fact, maybe reorienting is quite a big, challenging word. The better wording could be focus. Turkey's focus has in recent years have changed from Caucasus and the Black Sea mainly towards the Middle East, as we all know. And this has coincided with several developments in the region around Turkey and impacted by these developments also. So there is this two-way of relationship. Turkey's relations or Turkey's interest in different regions have been affected by Turkey's shift in focus towards the Middle East, but also the developments in these regions have affected Turkey's shift towards the Middle East. So one of the first, and I think the most instrumental change affecting Turkish approach to the Caucasus is the changing geopolitics of the region. This is sometimes ignored and do not understood properly, and sometimes it is situated in very recent period. But I would move it to the start of the changing of geopolitical alignment in the region to before 2008. What happened in 2008 August was partly a result of the changing of geopolitical alignment in the Caucasus. And in fact, I would put the changes, beginning of the changes to 2001, after the 9/11 events and after the United States started showing more interest to be present in the region. But these changes that I'm talking about after 2008, and especially it became very much consolidated between 2008 and 2014 are threefold. One is the withdrawal of the bulk of U.S. interests from the region. This is, I think, quite important. I'll come back to that. The second is a decline of the effectiveness of the EU engagement with the region. And the third is, of course, connected all this, is the resurgence of Russian influence in the region. And these three changes, let's say, also affected Turkey's approach to this region. As a result of these changes, Turkey came to a conclusion by about mid-2000s, I would say, but definitely by 2010, that Turkey came to a conclusion that cooperation with Russia in a wider geopolitical context might pay a higher dividends than continuation of confrontation policy or competition with Russian Federation. And that, of course, included Caucasus, where the biggest part of the competition was taking place beforehand. This, of course, had a plus in that it reduced the risk of direct confrontation or direct military confrontation with Russia in Turkey's vicinity. And added all this is, of course, the issues that everybody knows: increased economic cooperation, the trade reaching the $30 billion, energy cooperation, and military, finally the military cooperation, different aspects. So it's becoming a kind of a strategic connection. This was accompanied by Turkey's realization of its different routes and connections to the Caspian reaches. So Bakü-Tiflis-Ceyhan, Bakü-Tiflis-Erzurum pipelines, and also we could add Bakü-Tiflis-Kars railway line, all were realized or almost finished by this time. And this also consolidated Turkey's trade link with Azerbaijan and Georgia. So from this perspective also, there was not much rationale to continue to the competition with Russia in the Caucasus, because one of the main aims of Turkey's foreign policy in the early days in the Caucasus was to ensure connection to the Caspian reaches, which was realized by the 2000s. And there was nothing much to improve on that. Thirdly, the political consolidation of conflict zones in the Caucasus, especially after the 2008 war, and the borders of influence, in a sense, between Russia and Turkey.
We have 2 minutes more.
Okay, between Turkey and Russia also affected Turkey's approach to the region. From a Turkish perspective, there was not much to do to change this alignment in the region. It's very clear now by the 2010 that Azerbaijan and Georgia would continue to work with Turkey, Armenia would continue to work with Russia, and there was not much that Turkey could make to change that. And also there was another realization that the so-called frozen conflict could not be solved in the shorter period or in short to mid-term. So there was nothing Turkey could add to the solution unless the Western nations would start pressuring Russia, and that was not forthcoming. This all, of course, coincided with Turkey's disappointment with its Western relations with EU and with the United States. Added bonus of all this was, of course, the emergence of Syrian conflict, where Turkey started to cooperate with Russia in various theaters within Syria, which, of course, made Turkey to reconsider its wider policies within its vicinity, including Black Sea and the Caucasus. Finally, Turkey, it seems, came to a grudging acceptance of the current balance of power in the Caucasus, that it accepted that the balances of power in the Caucasus has shifted, at least slightly, favoring Russia. And there is nothing Turkey can do as a single-handedly to change that, unless there is a commitment from the Western countries or Western allies of Turkey to change that in a wider Black Sea region, including the Caucasus. So from the Turkish perspective, of course, there is too much a talk from the West and analysis, so much, but when you look at the practices on the ground, there is little progress and little change. And the case in point here is Georgian membership of NATO. For years, Turkey has been supporting it, calling for it, and there is no movement on it. So from that kind of a wider perspective, Turkey came to a position that instead of continuing its single-handed competition with Russia and confronting Russia head-on in the Caucasus for different areas, Turkey should better to focus on deepening its relations, its political and economic relations with two Caucasian countries, Georgia and Azerbaijan. I think that's what's been happening in recent years. And that also included some parts of the military relations as well, as far as I can follow. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aydin, for a very interesting introduction of Turkish foreign policy towards the region. I agree that we have quite good cooperation in trilateral cooperation between Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. I also understand the logic behind of the recent shift of the Turkish foreign policy. But also I would like to say that there are some, how to say, some questions, at least in Georgia, I cannot speak about other countries, that where the present Turkey is actually moving. Because as I said at the beginning, 10 or 15 years ago, Turkey was seen as a kind of role model for countries like Georgia in terms of Europeanization. And now, as you said, Turkey and some other actually scholars, they say Turkey now more concentrated to the Middle East, and it looks more like Middle Eastern power than European power. And that's actually, there's a lot of questions about this in Georgia, specifically because Georgia, together with Ukraine and Moldova, as you know, signed the association agreement, and we needed, strong kind of neighbor like Turkey, who would have a same kind of strategic, vision regarding the, EU membership and some other things. And we know that there were some shifts there. So having said that, I would like to ask Dr. Aksoy, what is your reading? I mean, how do you see this recent shifts of the Turkish foreign policy towards Caucasus, and what are the drivers of this foreign policy?
Thank you for inviting me to the panel. I will pretty much take on what Professor Aydin said and go a little bit back what happened and what is the main focus of Turkish foreign policy in the region. I was checking the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I think it has not been updated in the last 10 years, and it is still stated that Turkey's priorities in the region include maintenance of regional security and stability, supporting independence, territorial integrity and sovereignty of the South Caucasus countries, and their integration into European and Euro-Atlantic structures. That is sad that Turkey is still considering itself as part of the European of the alliance, right? But against this background, there are still three important points that provide the basis of analyzing Turkey's approach to the South Caucasus. The first one is Turkey's regional ambitions. I mean, Turkey is not only in South Caucasus, but in all neighboring regions is trying to be the regional power. But in the South Caucasus case, of course, there is the superpower Russia, and Turkey is trying to counterbalance it. And like also you said in your brief introduction, wants to play a significant role in economic and political life in the region. But we may not forget, considering this shift towards the Middle East and North Africa, so Turkish foreign policy pursues also identity politics. So that means that is said by supporting the Muslim and Turkic identity also in the region. And last but not least, the third one is, of course, domestic political circumstances that frequently shape and define the direction of Turkish foreign policy. Wrapping up, since the 1990s, Turkey is relying upon its credentials as a NATO member and an EU candidate country. It pursues toward the region, focusing on three issues: security and stability, as also Professor Aydin mentioned, energy and economic relations. And among these, of course, the most important one is the energy issue. And Ankara defines itself or pursues the policy of transforming the Caspian energy resource, to become a Caspian energy resources hub and enlarging energy transit to some European states. So this said Baku-Tbilisi Ceyhan pipeline, Erzurum gas pipeline, Trans-Anatolian pipeline, these all the agreements have completed the southern gas corridor intended to link the Caspian Sea. That shows us actually that Turkey, by engaging in economic energy issues, is still trying to be kind of a bridge towards Europe. And of course, we may not forget, Turkish foreign policy is also always has this incentive of searching for other markets, and the South Caucasus is also important, an additional market for Turkish products and services. But Turkey's ambitions are challenged by three important factors. The first one is the perennial conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. The second one is the historically strained Turkey-Armenia relations due to the Armenian genocide dispute. And the third one is, of course, the territorial integrity and sovereignty problems in the region. And let me first focus on the Turkish-Azerbaijani relations, that is said Nagorno-Karabakh. So Azerbaijan is, of course, holds a unique place in Turkish foreign policy. This closeness is not only due to their shared cultural and linguistic affinities, but also strong political and strategic interests. There is a bilateral agreement between Turkey and Azerbaijan, strategic partnership and mutual support, which has been signed in 2010. And this agreement obliges the two countries to assist each other using all possibilities in case of a military attack on on either of this country by a third country. And based on this agreement, Turkish and Azerbaijani militaries hold joint military exercises, and Turkish military helps Azerbaijan with weapons and personnel training. Then in early April 2016, Nagorno-Karabakh saw its most dangerous upsurge of violence between Armenia and Azerbaijan since the ceasefire in 1994. Turkey, of course, immediately sided with Azerbaijan, and Russia was siding with Armenia. The escalation was facilitated by Baku's improved military capabilities, and it increased the tension between Russia and Turkey. And it was exactly the time when the Russian Su-24 bomber plane was downed by the Turkish military. So the President Erdogan has criticized Kremlin not acting as a mediator. So especially considering its capacity of being a member in the Minsk group. So that is said, it is quite clear back then Erdogan was also aware of the fact that Russia has more power in, acting as a mediator. But despite all these exchanges, furious exchanges between Kremlin and Ankara, at the end, Moscow summoned the Armenian and Azerbaijani military officials and renewed the ceasefire. So we see that Ankara was pushed to, of course, side with Azerbaijan and opted a low profile, because back then in 2016, it was a turmoil time domestically, but also there was lots of problems in the Middle East. In any case, Turkey had no intention taking on Russia. So as Professor Aydin also said, Turkey did little to resolve the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, but it is also very hard to solve if you look at from the domestic point of view, because the government is using highly nationalistic rhetoric, and it has, it hinders Turkey to solve the problem where Armenia is in the play. So talking about that Turkey-Armenia relations, these relations have never been easy and remain very delicate and complex due to the dispute of Armenian genocide and the Nagorno-Karabakh weigh heavily on the present time relations. But as you may remember, in 2009, there was this football diplomacy, which at the end failed. But after 10 years, Moscow has tried. And as you might probably remember, in 2017, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has suggested a plan to open the Armenian-Turkish segment, I mean, of the border, you know, in the context of Eurasian Economic Union, and it was actually welcomed by the Turkish Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu. But both Armenians and Azerbaijanis subsequently rejected the scheme. The main conundrum in Turkey-Armenian relations revolves around this, you know, like how Armenia relates to Azerbaijan, how Turkey relates to both of them, and so, and the Nagorno-Karabakh.
Sorry again for the interruption, we have 2 more minutes.
Okay, so, and this is also another drive from domestic, this is the nationalistic constituencies. And the last but not least is the Turkey-Georgia relations. And as you already said, there are good relations, economically, politically, you know, border opening and so on and so forth. And Turkey is a key country for Georgia. But there is this, of course, problem of breakaway region of Abkhazia. And Turkey is actually developing good relations with Abkhazia due to the well-organized Abkhaz diaspora in Turkey, on the one hand, and, you know, like letting the Turkish businessmen invest, the businesswomen invest in the region, but at the same time keeping the relations quite good with Georgia. So altogether, Ankara has managed to navigate both relationships smoothly, fairly smoothly. But Ankara is also very careful because of this territorial integrity issues, also touches upon its own territorial integrity issue by saying this Kurdish issue within the country and Kurdish question in its neighboring Syria. So put together, Turkey is a dominating, I think still is a dominating foreign actor by developing and keeping or maintaining good relations with Georgia and Azerbaijan. But Russia remains a key power and has an enormous influence on Armenia and lesser degree to Azerbaijan and Georgia, and Turkey acknowledges Russia's advantage. But the only challenge is not the Russian hegemony or dominance in the region, but I think Turkey has to come up or come clear with all the surrounding problems that is experiencing right now. The most important is, of course, Turkey's situation in Syria, I mean the Syrian conflict, the Libyan war, which is increasing right now, the Kurdish issue, like I said before, with the Cyprus issue, it's deteriorating relations with the West. And I think considering all these problems, Turkey's direction towards South Caucasus will not be priority, but it will be secondary importance. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting analysis of the Turkish foreign policy towards South Caucasus. I agree that you know, for countries like Georgia, it's very important that support of Turkey of the territorial integrity of Georgia and Georgia's NATO bid, and we really appreciate that. Of course, there's a little bit ambiguity sometimes about the Turkish engagement in Abkhazia, and probably, you know, it takes a little bit more time until you know, Turkey and Georgian officials, they will how to say, will settle all these issues, because it's very important, as you understand, from Georgian side. At one point, it wants to have a you know, Turkey as a participant of this Georgian-Abkhaz you know, conflict resolution, but at the same time, you know, the territorial integrity and all other issues related to this is very important. Having said that, I would like to move to our next speaker, Dr. Licinia Simao, and I would like to ask her how she sees this recent, I would say, a little bit complicated relations between EU and Turkey and US and Turkey, because for a country like Georgia and generally for South Caucasus country, it's very difficult, you know, like to choose between Turkey or US or European Union, because all of them are very important actors for our region and for Georgia. So how would you explain this recent drifts between Turkey and Western actors? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kornely, for the invitation to join you today. And it's a pleasure to join all these colleagues in this very timely reflection. I would perhaps start with the idea of our last speaker and kind of pick it up, because the idea that Turkey is in the midst of a series of very important challenges, and more pressing challenges makes the South Caucasus actually look like a quite stable and predictable region considering everything else. And that, of course, contributes to make it a less priority, a smaller priority in terms of Turkish foreign policy. And I think I would kind of extrapolate a little bit on this idea and bring it perhaps to a systemic level of analysis, because the challenge that you gave me was to think about the US and the EU and how relations with Turkey affect how these two actors also behave in the region. And I think we should approach this from a systemic point of view. We are facing today a major shift, I think, in terms of how the world is organized and how it's led. If we look at how the US leadership has been exercised over the last years in Eurasia, for instance, we see it changing quite a lot. We have the US official documents and national security strategy looking at Eurasia much more focused on the rims of Eurasia and not on the heartland of Eurasia, where you would have the mainland connections. You have an administration that doesn't seem to have a clear policy towards the Caspian, the Caucasus in particular, or even the European neighborhood, if you want to call it like that. Even in the Middle East, you see important changes in US foreign policy with important consequences for a country like Turkey. So globally speaking, what you see is, I think, a bigger irrelevance of the countries that are around the Caspian, and kind of making this land corridor between Europe and China. Having said that, this is, I think, perhaps a misperception of US foreign policy, or at least developed aspect of US foreign policy that needs to be corrected. But when you look at it from the perspective of China, for instance, then the land corridors are quite important. And of course, you see major Chinese investments in Central Asia, but also in the Caucasus and elsewhere making inroads into Europe. So it's quite striking that although the US is more concerned with the maritime connections and the rim of the heartland of the Eurasian continent, you see China advancing quite quickly on that terrestrial front, let's say. So I think the US should at some point complement and revise this part of its strategy and be more present, because it remains a fundamental actor for the South Caucasus and also for European partners. On the perspective of the European Union, what you see here is well-established relations with many of these countries in the South Caucasus. Azerbaijan is perhaps the one where things remain a bit more complicated, but the EU has managed to have direct conversations and direct relations with these countries. It doesn't need Turkey as much as it did before to push a specific model. We have direct channels that are being developed and sustained. So also because Turkey is going itself through a period where its European ambitions, as you pointed to, Kornely, are not so clear, and where the relations are quite complicated if you think of issues relating to Cyprus, as we just heard, or the refugees that remain such a complicated issue to address, and fundamentally also the issue of the nature of the regime in Turkey, and the issue of democracy and human rights. Then you do not have a good context for Turkey to be perceived by the European member states and the institutions as a valuable or irreplaceable partner to reach onto the Caucasus. We have direct channels to do it. Having said that, of course, I think neither the US nor the European Union, its member states and institutions, are in any position to not engage with Turkey. But that is something else that has to do, of course, with the more pressing issues in everyone's agenda, like the conflicts in the Middle East, Syria, Libya, like you rightly mentioned. We have a very complicated situation there. All of this is more pressing in the international agenda of the US and particularly of the Europeans, and of Turkey as well. So you see the South Caucasus actually looks quite peaceful and stable for the moment when compared to all the big challenges that we are facing elsewhere. We are still living a pandemic situation, and this, of course, also provokes a reshifting of priorities in some way for many partners. I'm happy to see that the European Union has stepped up and provided support and assistance to its partners in the Balkans and in the South Caucasus. But let's see how long it can sustain this, and then let's see what's the impact of this assistance in terms of the long-term project that the European Union has for the region. But again, Turkey is not a fundamental partner here. Regarding the conflicts where we would expect Turkey to be present and sustain some efforts for mediation and negotiation towards conflict resolution, I share the opinion of my two previous colleagues. It's very hard. There are no perspectives to solve these conflicts. Russia has maintains a position of veto regarding many of these dynamics. Neither in the European Union nor in the US, who have a major urge to address this, then it from the perspective of the external impulse, it will remain very much as it is for some time now. We have more urgent issues to deal. And this seems to be a recurrent feature of politics in the South Caucasus, is that whenever it becomes particularly important for international actors and powerful international actors, there is movement on the ground, there are changes, there are possibilities that open. Whenever the international politics pushes attention away from the region, everything seems to be stopped, and there is no self-sustained movement towards conflict resolution is one area where this is particularly visible, but you could find others. This is, I don't want to sound like there is nothing happening in the region and there are no relevant issues to look at. What I'm just saying is that the big international players, the most powerful players at this time, are not looking at those developments. But I think of all of them, the European Union is perhaps the one that is better positioned right now to continue accompanying reforms, consolidating the political institutions, which is a major aspect of stability in the years to come, not only in the region but elsewhere. Issues of modernization and making sure the region, the South Caucasus, is fully integrated into the new globalization that is taking shape. You're talking about connectivity projects, you're talking about technology, you are talking about also making sure that the societies of the South Caucasus are fully integrated into this new technological age we are looking at, and that they are fully integrated into the connectivity projects linking Europe to elsewhere. I think that is quite an ambitious but quite possible. It's a realistic possibility, in my view, that the EU will look at itself as
2 minutes
as a power in the engaged in these processes of our time, and that it will bring the partners of the South Caucasus on board of these adventures. So I think having Turkey on board would be always a plus. I'm not sure there are the conditions at the moment, neither in Turkey nor elsewhere, are there for Turkey to play a major role in bringing the South Caucasus closer to this vision we'll have of proximity to the EU. I would just like perhaps to say that the European model is not the only model available, and I think the pandemic has also shown that surveillance and control over the citizens, the suppression of civil liberties is a trend. It's a trend where authoritarian regimes and authoritarian trends become entrenched even inside Europe. So I think for the foreseeable future, you will also see a continuation of this challenge of the Western model, if you want to still call it like that, of democracy and human rights. And you will have a very pragmatic view of challenges ahead, I think. And I think for the countries of the South Caucasus, whether Turkey works as an anchor of Europeanization, as you put it, Kornely, or whether they will be pushed also on to more pragmatic views of their own interests, I think we should accompany that. And I wouldn't be surprised if you would see very pragmatical decisions being made in the years to come, because the investment in the European model, in the Western model, is very much sustained by right now by the European institutions, and you need the member states, you would need the US, you would need like-minded countries to look at the spread of these values and ways of being and institutions as a valuable part of stability in this region. So I would leave it at that perhaps now.
Thank you, Licinia, for a very interesting conversation. I agree that EU has a direct links with South Caucasus countries. That's true, especially with Georgia, Armenia, and maybe after a while, maybe even Azerbaijan could be the case. But I think EU's role also is very important to engage Turkey in this democratization process in long term. Maybe time is not ripe right now for this, but I think we need Turkey as a kind of supporter of the democratization in the region, and not only South Caucasus but in other parts of the Europe as well. Having said that, I would like to turn to our last but not least speaker, Ivanna Machitidze, who actually recently published with our project a paper on how about the Turkish-Russian relations and how this, what kind of impact actually it has on Georgia. So what I would like to do is that I would pose question a little bit differently to you, Ivanna, and to give us a little bit more bigger picture, not only about Georgia, but about South Caucasus, how the Turkish-Russian relations actually, what kind of impact it has on South Caucasus and where it can lead. Because for some countries, like for Georgia, this is sometimes could be a little bit alarming because, as I said, we have very good relations with Turkey, but we have a little more complicated relations with Turkey. So, and historically, we were not happy when these two powers actually had a good relation. So we remember this from our first republic during, when from 1918 to 21, when actually because of this good relations between the two powers, actually, according to many Georgians, we kind of lost our independence, and also some other countries in the region. So what do you say about this? So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, welcome all. And I'd like to thank Georgian Institute of Politics and Heinrich South Caucasus for organizing, for hosting this extremely interesting discussion. And I would like to thank all of the previous participants who contributed to the discussion. I will also try to do my best to do so as well. And I would like to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint presentation, but I think this function is disabled, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe you can help me.
I think you should be able to do that.
No, because it's written that host disabled participant screen share.
Givi, can you try to share?
Maybe, is it okay if I share because I have your slides?
No, it's already on. You will say it now.
Yeah, sure. Then I will continue from, and then I will tell you to switch the slides.
Salome, do you have it on? Because we don't see it.
Actually, I think I can share it. One moment. Yeah,
you should be able to share it. Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, I think, can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, so then okay, so I have a rather challenging question today to discuss in 10 minutes. So this is the issue of Turkey-Russia relations, how the current trends they influence the South Caucasus and what kind of implications they do have for it. So first, as the brief outline, I would like to very generally to speak about the brief context because some points were mentioned already. Then what kind of implications they have for the South Caucasus. The issue that I would like to speak here is what kind of periods of relations in between Russia and Turkey, whether it's kind of confrontation or whether it's a cooperation, what kind of period is beneficial for the South Caucasus particular countries. And then I would like still to elaborate a little bit more on the so-called Turkey-Russia complicated relations pattern and the implications it has for Georgia. And I will explain why specifically for Georgia it is extremely relevant. So now, while discussing in general the features of the Turkey-Russia relations, first of all, these are kind of love and hate, very uneasy relations in between each other, because both Turkey and Russia, they do understand that they need each other. At the same time, as it was already mentioned by the previous contributors, their interests have been becoming increasingly, at the same time, pursuing the similar goals. I will say that they have been rather overstretching themselves, because both Russia and Turkey now have rather colliding interest in the Middle East as well. This is the issue of Syria. This is the issue of Libya, where they occupy diverse positions. And at the same time, this is the very much pragmatic relations, because they do understand that they cannot allow themselves a direct confrontation. And this is why, kind of my last point, but not the least, there is rather low possibility of direct confrontation between Turkey and Russia, because just they simply will lose much more than they will benefit from it. And they do understand it. And this is why at every single moment of this kind of let's say tensed relations between Turkey and Russia, and when different experts and think tanks, they start writing about what kind of implications it might have, the ending point here is that the understanding is that Turkey and Russia, they cannot allow themselves the far-reaching tense confrontation. So they do have a rather common challenges that they experience. First of all, both Turkey and Russia, they kind of strive to make both Turkey great again and Russia great again, because both of them, they have this kind of nostalgia for their glorious historical past. And South Caucasus, of course, occupy here a very important role, but not only. And what was mentioned, that Turkey is increasingly has been turned towards the Middle East, and I would agree that South Caucasus occupies more and more secondary role, taking into account that Turkey does recognize Russia's dominant position in the South Caucasus, and Turkey is very much navigating inside the Russia-led and Russia-guided South Caucasus. At the same time, they do need the foreign policy success and the foreign policy achievements for legitimizing their domestic regimes that are increasingly authoritarian. And this is another part of discussion that I will elaborate more. Another is that Turkey-Russia relations are characterized by this very much personal relations of Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Vladimir Putin. They both are of the same age. They are both of approximately the same age in politics, being the high-profile representatives in Turkish and Russian politics. They have been both having experience of occupying different decision-making positions of prime ministers and presidents to a different extent. They know each other very well, and they have a very long-term experience of arranging this escalated moments of their relations. So the Turkey-Russia relations, they're very much concentrated on this personal relations, taking into account that other decision-making institutions in both countries, they are really kind of lacking that power to influence the relations, taking into account that, again, the authoritarianism trends have been on the rise in both cases. So this is mostly the leaders of the state and the small group of people who, in a way, influences their decisions. This is just very briefly the map of the major gas pipelines and projects, that of which you, of course, I guess know, but just for visualization. And here I would like to elaborate a bit more about points of agreement. So first of all, kind of points of similarity agreement. This is one, surging authoritarianism trends. Erdogan increasingly assessed as the one taking...
No, my apologies. You have 2 more minutes.
Okay, yeah, a Putin scenario. Then this is mutual support in very like extremely important moments, for instance, like the July 2016 coup attempt, and then, for instance, Russia's support in the EU introduced sanctions, which in a way it also expressed. Then both countries, Turkey's frustration over EU and NATO, and then both countries and Russia's very uneasy stance with the EU and NATO enlargement to the east. Then the issue of crisis in Ukraine, which happily does not really have a very high agenda in terms of Turkish priorities, but Turkey does care about Crimean Tatars. And this is part of its attention towards the Muslim and Turkey communities. Also, a very important point is Russia's military buildup in Turkey's neighborhood, especially in the Black Sea area. And this is something that decreases Turkey's like potential might there in the Black Sea. Now Crimea becomes part of the Southern Military District, the cooperation agreement with Armenia, which does exclude Nagorno-Karabakh, but still. So this is then Abkhazia. So all of this makes Turkey even more kind of stressed, not only as the junior partner in the South Caucasus, but also because of the Russia's growing influence in the Black Sea area. And also the growing criticism in terms of the kind of Turkey's economic, growing economic dependence over Russia. If it will be necessary, then we can elaborate more during the discussion. What about South Caucasus? First of all, as we mentioned, this is kind of a competition, but from the very beginning competition, then most of the recognition that the Russian world is kind of huger. In what concerns South Caucasus. The second point is that the extra-regional power, there is an agreement between Turkey and Russia, they should stay away from the region. So this is Russia and Turkey who will decide what will happen in the South Caucasus. And then, if not Russia, then who? So there is this brief quotation on the then Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, who gave an interview for Vesti. And what he basically says, you can have a look in the full version, but like if not Russia will be selling both arms to Armenia and Azerbaijan, because that was a commentary he gave after the Nagorno-Karabakh escalation, then who will? There will be someone else who will replace Russia in this respect. And this is something that, of course, Russia will not allow, because then by selling both arms to Armenia and Azerbaijan, it is in a way able to balance the situation and to provide for at least for the no escalation of the conflict. Another issue is that, judging from that, I believe that the South Caucasus, especially Armenia and Azerbaijan, Armenia, because of its very much political, economical, security dependence on Russia, Azerbaijan, because it already has been maintaining, especially after the 2008 war, Georgian-Russian war, a very careful balance, both with Russia and of course strategically important relations with Turkey. For themselves, the so-called rapprochement between Russia and Turkey will be rather beneficial rather than confrontation. Unlike for Georgia, because in case of Georgia, there are both kind of windows of opportunities and challenges, because when there is the confrontation between Russia and Turkey, as it happened just recently, because of the Idlib crisis in the beginning of 2020, or as it was happening in 2015, Georgia has to take sides, because Turkey for itself is the only, let's say, the gateway to NATO. Turkey strategically, this is a strategic partner of Georgia, Turkey, and the recent declaration of Çavuşoğlu is that it supports Georgia's NATO's ambition, although it does play a really last role in terms of Georgia's Europeanization and EU integration efforts because of its own very much tense relation with the EU. So definitely I will agree that in this respect, Turkey has been losing its very much strategic stance. Unlike NATO, and Turkey still has the chance to let's say, preserve its very strategic meaning for Georgia in terms of it being the NATO, not only the NATO member, but actually the NATO ally, and to resolve that much discussed conflict over the S-400 and the military cooperation with Russia that is, unfortunately for Georgia and for itself being a NATO member, has been on the growth. But also, I will not mention specifically what was already said about Georgia's very strategic place in Turkey-Georgia-Azerbaijan triangle cooperation. It is both economic cooperation, sectoral cooperation, as well as the military one. Georgia has a very strategic place for the transit of Russian energy to Armenia. So Georgia for Turkey is the way to maintain its energy security in terms of the Caspian Sea supplies. However, at the same time, Georgia cannot allow itself—
No, sorry, you have 1 minute to conclude.
Yeah, I will just finalize. Georgia cannot allow itself as the small state to be constantly squeezed in between this Russia and Turkey cooperation and conflicting moments. So therefore, I do believe that Georgia has to make use of its NATO and EU aspirations, and EU should pay a even much more close attention to Georgia that so far does not have any institutional umbrella that will protect itself apart from the Eastern Partnership. And Georgia is a high performer in this respect. And also Georgia is it's a small player, but a very strategic one for the Black Sea security. And here there is a chance to maintain dialogue, and for Georgia, even despite its rather little significance, but still it can increase its significance by being a more proactive player, and especially through the dialogue with Romania, with the Baltic states, through this Black Sea Baltic states access cooperation, to increase its profile and to show even more significance. Yeah, and so therefore, in terms of this, to be protected in the moments of this Russia-Turkey rather uneasy relations in times, and these moments have been becoming more frequent, Georgia has to maneuver first of all, but then there should be even much more attention and strategic importance assigned to Georgia by both NATO and EU. But I believe, first of all, the EU, like to the first extent. So thank you very much, and yeah, I hope for a very fruitful discussion. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Ivanna. I think it was very interesting analysis, and we are a little bit running behind of schedule. As I said earlier, we will have 2 rounds of Q&A, and in first round, actually, we will ask panelists to answer the questions which was already written in the Q&A, and I will ask Givi to read these written questions. And in second part, there will be floor open for discussion, and participants actually allowed to raise hand and ask the question verbally to the panelists. So Givi, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting, but I will just start with the questions. So first question is from Mustafa Aydin. This question does not have specific addressee. So the question goes, given the numerous Georgian citizens working in Turkey and close cooperation in the tourism sector, how could the COVID-19 pandemic influence Turkish-Georgia relations? Maybe I will list all the 4 questions that we have, and then they can answer at once, right?
Sure.
Okay, the second question is to Professor Mustafa Aydin. It's from Dr. Shoaib Khan. So the question starts with a brief remark that in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Turkish tilt was towards Azerbaijan, while at the same time Turkey entered in agreement with Armenia. So the question is how far it will be possible for Turkey to maintain balance between the 2 countries in the coming future, considering the multi-vectored foreign policy of the present Turkish government. So that was the second question. Third question is also a general question. It's about the prospects of Turkey-Armenia rapprochement. So the question is there a chance of rapprochement? And If yes, how would you imagine that? And the last question, is Turkey's foreign policy in the South Caucasus mostly guided by realpolitik considerations, or by cost-benefit calculations, or by understandings of identities and norms? So the author of this question kind of is interested in which dimension of the above-mentioned three aspects seems to be prevailing. I guess that's all the questions.
Thank you, Gibi. I think maybe we can ask Dr. Mustafa Aydin to maybe answer, and we will have 3 minutes for each panelist, and because we need to go for second row as well. So Mustafa Aydin, floor is yours. We cannot hear you. We cannot hear you.
Now you can, I think.
Yes.
Yes, leaving the COVID question to the last, we have two questions on Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey that's related. So let me start from there. I think it's time where Turkey was trying to be in balance between Armenia, Azerbaijan has passed, if there was any such a time. Now the Azerbaijan has overwhelming effect and influence in Turkey, domestically and also economically. The connection between Turkey and Azerbaijan has moved beyond simple identity and ethnicity, and now it's a strategic connection, linking to energy investment, economics, and other investments also. So there is this huge benefit and also a military aspect as well. So I don't think Turkey can play anymore a role, a neutral role between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Having said this, unfortunately, I don't see much a chance of reviving Turkey-Armenian rapprochement unless there is a movement in Nagorno-Karabakh. I never use the word solution, but movement has always been a condition from Turkey to start something doing in Armenia, in its relations with Armenia. In the last case where Turkey and Armenia signed protocols, even then it was kind of conditioned for the movement of something on Karabakh, which didn't happen, and the process has collapsed. So I think there is nothing changed there. Turkey's Caucasus policy, I think, is a kind of a mixture of the three. The importance of realpolitik is obviously there. Cost-benefit analysis comes to it when it connects to Turkey's economic benefits, and identity comes to the question when it relates to Azerbaijan and Armenia. But overwhelmingly, all these are linked, I think, in a realpolitik perspective, and how Turkey sees or analyzes this cost-benefit calculation. COVID-19 question is very difficult to answer. Actually, Turkey has recently allowed workers to come to the Black Sea coast for agricultural work, but that didn't include international guest workers. But the normalization process is just started. The Turkish government has not announced any plans for international travel yet, whether to allow the neighbors to enter the country or not. But I presume it will be normalized soon. Those Georgian citizens who are living in Turkey, the restrictions have already withdrawn. It's already stopped and normalization started. But beyond that, I have no idea about this, how it might affect.
Thank you. Dr. Aksoy, floor is yours.
Thank you. I also agree with Professor Aydin that I don't see any possible rapprochement between Armenia and Turkey given the context. But I was reading a report from the International Crisis Group on Turkey-Russia relations, and Ivanna has also talked about it. I mean, if these two countries, you know, like the superpower Russia and the regional power Turkey, decides to dig into the conflict, I mean, they are not going to solve it, but the movement could be in the way that there will be no tensions between two countries. So that means Moscow and Ankara could work together to, for the long-term peace in the region, and that to keep the transit towards Asia and the Middle East. But we do not see any development in that sense, because now the second round is opened in Libya besides Syria. But I think Ankara could still use its ties to NATO, because Ankara is a member of NATO, although now we are really questioning its identity, NATO identity. But it can, I mean, if it comes to that, if it comes to that, Moscow and Ankara would initiate something between Armenia and Azerbaijan, then Ankara can also, include the Western allies to that, but I still think it's quite unlikely at the moment. But I think personally, I mean, I think Licinia can say more about that. EU should continue its engagement in democratization of civil society in those countries and understanding between the two countries. But given the fact that both countries, that is said, Armenia and Azerbaijan, has been developing its military capabilities, where Turkey and Russia is heavily supporting them, yeah, so militaristic approach at the moment dominates the democratization or peace approach, I guess. And considering the pandemic, I think it's too early to say about that, because only thing that what we can state is that the economic prospect of Turkey doesn't seem very good, but it's not only valid for Turkey, but on the global level. And considering the last question that you mentioned, I think all three theories can be combined in the case of Turkish foreign policy approach towards South Caucasus. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Licinia, floor is yours.
Yes, so I perhaps start with this last one. Also, the last question. None of these categories are self-sufficient. I mean, balance of power, cost-benefit analysis, and identity issues, they coexist in decision makers' thinking, and I think, of course, this is also the case for Turkey, for Turkish foreign policy in the South Caucasus. You can push identity issues forward more whenever it becomes more relevant, or when the situation on the ground demands it. You can look more into cost-benefit analysis, but also the issues of balance of power are also present. So I think in a way it's a mix of at least these three sets of factors that needs to be brought always into the analysis. I think cost-benefit was a very clear priority when Turkey was also thinking of consolidating its position as an energy hub and transportation hub, and so all of those connectivity projects to the Caspian were developed. That was a very clear cost and benefit analysis, but also it is a geopolitical view of how it can develop further ahead its relations in terms of balance of power. I find it very interesting what we've been saying regarding this relationship between Turkey and Russia, and how the two actors can in the future have some room to define regional dynamics without external interference. And this kind of assumes that the two will meet eye to eye on many of the issues, which I doubt. Unless, of course, Turkey is ready to say yes to whatever Russia wants to do in the region. And that's perhaps also the scenario where Turkey and Russia can contribute to solve the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, or at least change the current status quo. That I can only imagine that if it is Turkey that is willing to follow Russian lead on that. I can't genuinely see a situation where Russia would have an interest in having Turkey kind of lead the process in any direction. So if Turkey is ready to follow Russian lead, then maybe we can have a situation where Turkey will facilitate some of Russia's interests in the region. I don't see that to be very beneficial to Turkey's relations with the South Caucasus countries directly, because this is the biggest fear, is that Russia will reinforce its power in the region by having a strong ally and cutting, let's say, what had been perceived as a vital connection to the West. So I think it's a difficult position for Turkey to be in if that's the case. And a final, very brief note on this issue of the EU and how the EU sees the region, and perhaps this can also kind of respond to how the EU will behave and look at these dynamics, well, I was recently discussing also some of these issues with someone from dealing with the Eastern neighborhoods and with the East neighbors, and you have these 5 priorities at the moment that are kind of established within the European institutions and also with support from the member states. These 5 long-term objectives, and they talk about resilient, sustainable, and integrated economies, accelerating digital transformations, accelerating the green transformations, resilience of public institutions and rule of law is still there, and also this idea of inclusive societies, and basically that you were discussing and talking to a set of actors on a horizontal level inside these countries and not just the government. So, I mean, you will see that you continue to push these objectives in the region, but it has to deal with a very different reality that in the case of the South Caucasus is still very much led by Russia in the absence of a strong US presence, I would say.
Thank you, Licinia. And Ivanna, we'd like to hear your comment as well.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, starting from the last question, I do believe that this is in a way the mixture of 3 categories. However, I think that this is the denomination of cost-benefit analysis on behalf of Turkey to a large extent, as well as maybe the second place I would give to real politics. But of course, 3 matter for sure. To be brief, then what concerns Turkey, Armenia rapprochement, that's not something that is on the agenda because it seems that judging from the domestic politics for Turkey now, the Kurdish issues, the refugee issues, they overshadow this the issue of Armenia, as it seems. Another thing is that their junior partner in the coalition, the MHP party, would not really be happy, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of this idea. And yeah, third, that it all will take place with the approval of Russia. So if Russia will be kind enough to, in a way, allow this rapprochement, then yes, like it happened in 2007, of Lavrov comments. What concerns Armenia-Azerbaijan question, I guess, if I'm not mistaken, I think a very important issue now is Nakhchivan and the combined army there, and then the Turkish participation as well in Azerbaijan's different military exercises, and some rumors that there might be even the alternative to the Gyumri base in Armenia. So that's also an interesting thing to look after. And what concerns the Turkish pandemic situation, I think that we will see, because this is the precedent that did not happen before. But anyways, as the experience of other countries shows, like of Nordic countries, they do need the working force, they do need the migrants, and this is why this will be one of the issues that seems to be arranged. Maybe not as the priority, but that's definitely very important for Turkish economy as well. So this is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivanna. So as I said, now participants actually allowed to raise their hand and ask the questions directly. So if there's any question, you should actually indicate to whom you would like to address this question. If there's any hand, and I would like to ask Ninutsa to allow the people who will raise the hand, if there is any.
Yes, they are allowed.
Okay.
Just for your information, if there are no hands, there are still 2 written questions, and I can read them out loud for them.
Okay.
It's better if you read it.
Okay, then I will proceed. So the first question is to Dr. Ivanna Machitidze. This question refers to the developments in David Karaca Monastery. So the question is this a sort of border issue between the 2 countries, or there is a third party involved in the dispute? And if you think this way, who is this third party? And the second question is a general question. So start with a brief description. The Turkish foreign minister has called for NATO expansion, and in particular for the accession of Georgia to the alliance. But on the other hand, Turkey has threatened several times to leave the alliance. So the author of this question just asks you to comment generally about this. What do you think about it? What can you say about this? Thank you.
Ivanna, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think I was not really clear on the second question. What concerns the David Garaji issue and as part of the Georgian-Azerbaijani relations? I think this is in a way the both like the border and identity issue as well. About the third party is difficult to say, but what it seems, it does not really have the like overwhelming like this decisive influence on the Azerbaijan, otherwise strategic Azerbaijan-Georgia relations. So I would say that this is both of them, definitely. What concerns the second issue, I could not understand what was about NATO, the NATO membership. If you could repeat.
Yes, it's a general question to everybody. The Turkish foreign minister has called for NATO expansion and especially kind of called for the accession of Georgia recently. But on the other hand, Turkey in itself has threatened several times that it will leave the alliance, NATO. So just...
Okay, I see. Yeah, what concerns the statement, this is a very of strategic importance for Georgia, for sure, as the support on behalf of Turkey, but also it does, in a way, bears, you know, we have to see what will happen with the final, like that postponement now of deployment of S-400, because so far, because of the pandemics and all the situation, it did not really have a continuation. So it would have a much more of a value in a way if Turkey would have been a much more faithful ally to NATO. But in general, it has a huge strategic importance, and of course for Georgia, Turkey's support is the core one because this is the only NATO member that it borders on. So.
Thank you, Ivanna. And I would like, as I see, we have one, I would like to welcome Dr. Shuab Khan. As far as I understand, he has a question. So please, sir, floor is yours.
Hello.
We cannot hear you well.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, we have very bad connection, unfortunately. Maybe it's better.
Yeah, it's
unfortunately,
write down the question.
Exactly. Please write down the question, and meanwhile, there is Alexander Kukhyanidze who has a question. I'll give him the floor then.
Okay.
You hear me well?
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, thank you. I'm Alexander Kukhyanidze, Kornely's colleague. I have a question connected to Turkey. Everything you discussed today is like Turkish foreign policy concerning South Caucasus. It's really good, but a lot depends on how Turkish policy was changed in the last several years. We knew Turkey as a parliamentary republic, democratic, which is trying to join European Union, NATO member, and that was for Georgia always a hope, like way to the west. Turkey was identified in Georgian perception as a power representing the West, if not fully, but anyway as NATO member. That was a big hope, especially because we had huge problems in relations with Russia. But then after these attempts of coup d'etat, then transition to consolidation, Erdogan's power, we see authoritarian trends, massive arrests, violations of human rights, problems in relations with United States, European Union, Germany, even NATO, playing game with Russia, this southern gas pipeline, joint military actions in Syria, or anyway plans, which makes us very cautious what happens if Turkish-Russian relations are essentially improved. Then Georgia will, based on authoritarian, because friendship with Russia is destructive for Georgia. So we are quite cautious about Turkey, not as optimistic as it was years ago. What do you think? First of all, I want to ask my Turkish colleagues. I understand situation very different today is in Turkey. I mean, freedom of speech and so on, censorship. But anyway, if you can, of course, frankly, explain Turkey's democratic future. Look at America today. Only one racist policeman killed this black guy and the whole America stood up. Enormous civil pressure on the whole government. Of course, everything was collected, this coronavirus, but also Trump's authoritarian behavior. It's unbelievable to see something similar in Georgia, also in Turkey. Nothing to say about Russia, I don't mean Russia.
Thank you, Professor Kukhyanidze.
Yeah. Do you understand the question, yeah?
Yeah, maybe if you can repeat once more.
Okay, just summarizing it, Turkey's democratic future, which would help consolidate Georgian-Turkish relations.
Thank you. Thank you. Can maybe one of our speakers can pick up or comment on this? Who would like to go? Doctor?
About the Turkey's democratic future. I mean, I think we all made it quite clear there is a shift in Turkey's role in compared to the 90s and 2000. Turkey has changed, as you also described, and I think we should use alternative perspectives to the rapprochement between Russia and Turkey, because it is clear that a good friendship with Russia would be, you say, dangerous for Georgia, but on the other hand, Turkey can use its leverage in this rapprochement, because it also gives Turkey the better hand so that Russia can also reach to the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean and so on. So I think Turkey, I mean, it doesn't necessarily be this senior junior partner, because both sides have, gains and losses in this relation. So, and democratic trajectory of Turkey, as you said, I mean, I don't disagree with defining Turkish political system as an authoritarian system, but like my colleague from Portugal also said, there is a trend, unfortunately, around the globe about the rise of authoritarian politics. And we feel it not only in society, but in the political systems. We see, dominance of executive powers, and they are being used to disbalance the balance of powers. And I cannot foresee how would it end, but it makes me, of course, sad to see that there is a global trend to that. And Turkey, Russia, Venezuela, Hungary, Poland are the classical examples of it, and other countries are also looking, because as my colleague said, the absence of US and absence of the European Union or different European states as a political actor who could have leverage could be seen and analyzed in this situation. So there is no leverage from the West at the moment on Turkey, neither in the South Caucasus. And how could it be changed is the question that the politicians have to answer, I think.
Thank you very much. Professor Aydin, do you have something to comment? please do. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Let me start with Natavan Aliyeva's question, and then I'll come back to this one. The question is about NATO and Turkey's call for expansion. First of all, Turkey never, ever threatened to leave NATO. I never heard any Turkish official or indeed politician to say that we should leave NATO. There is always a criticism of the United States, especially in the recent years, but never ever nobody talked about leaving NATO. And there was a flirtation of the President Erdogan with the idea of connecting to Shanghai Cooperation Initiative, but it was, it was just a kind of an observation position, never intended and thought as an alternative to Turkey's NATO connection. And regarding the Georgia's membership in NATO, that has been always been Turkey's position since the independence of Georgia. And it's not a recent policy, or it's not new. It's just a repetition of old idea. But I think everybody in Turkey, all the policymakers, also realize that this is not going to happen soon, but due to decision-making procedure within NATO. So coming back to the Turkey's European credentials, democracy, quality of democracy, and etc. Of course, I know the history of how Georgians analyze Turkey, how Georgians saw Turkey as a conduit to their relationship to Europe, or the connection to Europe or NATO. Whether this was really the intention of Turkey at all, at any time, it's not the case anymore. I can understand the value of Turkey's European connections and alluring of that connections for the regional countries, including not only the Caucasus country, but also in the Middle East. There is value there, but nevertheless, we are where we are. And it's not only the result of the domestic changes in Turkey, of course. The movement to change the system of government in Turkey to presidential system was only 2 years old. Turkey's connection with Europe was frozen, 2007. So the process has been making in the long term, although it does affect countries' approach with different countries and relationship with different countries, whether you have a presidential style or whether you have a group decision-making does affect the country's relationship with various countries, but nevertheless, this is where we are. And so the Georgians should have to start looking the reality on the ground. This is what we have. And there is no short way in the near future that Turkey's European connection restart or rejump or the negotiations. And it's not only due to Turkey, of course. The approach in Europe and many politicians, many countries, their decisions, their analysis also have moved away. So the world has changed, Turkey has changed, and you have to see Turkey as it is, as a country in the region, a neighboring country, or actually that it saw itself as a part of the Caucasus. So the value of Turkey as itself should be calculated instead of value of Turkey in connection with Europe. And this is the reality we are today. I understand the connection in the domestic politics and the changes, but what can you do? This is the reality on the ground.
Thank you very much. Licinia, would you like to comment on this?
Perhaps just a brief final comment. I agree very much with this very sober assessment that Turkey has a value in itself and has changed and is continually also changing its own interests and views regarding its relations with the Caucasus, with Russia, with other important regional actors. And having that in mind, I think the South Caucasus has leaders and societies need, of course, to navigate these waters. It's not always easy. Have a dynamic assessment of the interests and priorities of its partners and neighbors, and chart the best way ahead considering their own objectives to assist them. You have to reinforce the partnerships that are relevant at a certain point, and then reassess them regularly to make sure that you are navigating towards the right direction. I mean, we do have these authoritarian trends that are widespread. The challenges to the Western order, to the liberal Western order, didn't disappear with this pandemic. They only perhaps became even more evident in that case. So we are in a moment where international order is shifting, and this has, of course, regional implications. If continuing the strong connection to Europe is a priority for the countries in the region, then that connection has to be consolidated directly with Europe, with the institutions, with the member states. And then you add on to that whatever other elements you can, if you can. But the context right now is quite complicated, I would say. You don't have a lot of enthusiasts for democracy and human rights abounding in Europe, I would say, and around Europe. I think it's fair to say that the European Union is by far one of the most engaged actors in the region. I mean, this initiative that the Stiftung is organizing is just an example of how member states pay attention, they invest, they are present side by side with the institutions. So it is present, it is doing its work, and I think that's where we need to look for in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Licinia. And before I hand over to Ivanna, I would like her also to address, there's a question in Q&A for you. And before that, I would like to Stefan to comment, and after that, I will turn to Ivanna back.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting discussion. Sorry, I just have to comment also as a Russia expert, so someone who is dealing with Russia from a German perspective since many years, and also with the region. I really, just 2 points. I think we are really in a transition period. And I also think that we're talking here about 2 weak players who are becoming more weak. So Turkey is hit by this economic crisis, Russia is hit by the economic crisis, and the pandemic will even strengthen this, or will even weaken these countries. And I see more differences between Turkey and Russia than that they have in common. Russia is a player who is destabilizing its neighborhood, who is maybe at the moment has more leeway on Turkey than in the opposite. But I would not overestimate this, how to say, this kind of coalition of interests of players who have at the moment problems with the US, with the EU, and maybe because of this reason they are cooperating. So I agree that this is making the whole picture more complex, especially from the South Caucasus view. But I see this as a transition period, and I see here more problems than really a policy of any kind of sustainability from both sides. And for me, it's really the questions how other players like China, but maybe also the EU will shift its policy and play here a bigger role. So I'm pessimistic, but I'm also somehow optimistic or realistic that things will somehow change. And I don't see this coalition really going on, sustaining, between Turkey and Russia in this sense. Sorry for interrupting.
Thank you, Stefan. And as we're running really behind of schedule, I would like Ivanna, if you can, to give her a few questions.
Yeah, so what concerns authoritarianism, I have spoken in my presentation about that, but what I want to first stress is that idea like that Russia, Turkey, they are partners not because they're pragmatic partners. So they are the authoritarianism, the surge in authoritarianism trends in both Russia and Turkey. It's kind of a secondary issue, I would say. That of course makes the language more clear between the countries, but this is not a kind of definitely a coalition so far. The other thing is that if we compare Russian and Turkish, in a way, kind of this surge in authoritarianism, we can say that Russia's, for Georgia, it has, like Turkey, wages more this values, norms-free policy. So it does not as much meddle with, like, for instance, irritated with Georgia's democratization like Russia is. So I think this is a very important difference between the two. This is what I wanted to say. I think
Thank you, Ivana. And I would give maybe for last concluding remarks 1 minute to each speaker if they want, or if they don't want, they can skip. Actually, there's one question from George Cerlishvili to Turkish participants, and if you can also refer to that for last 1 minute. So who can start? Maybe Dr. Aksoy from your side? Just to
I mean, I did see the question, but I think, yeah, it is also related with Europeanization. I agree with Professor Aydin. I mean, this, you know, like, it is quite easy to pinpoint the domestic politics and what happened in Turkey in the last 10 years and so, and this you know, seeing this shift. But yeah, I mean, the relations were already frozen, I'm not frozen, but really deteriorated 2007, which has also the European dynamics in it. And I think it's important, if you want, if you say like Mr. Meister said, yes, it is true, Russia-Turkey relations should not be a long-term relation. It can be changed. It's in transition period, to say. But I say the EU has to, first of all, play a more concrete role, and become a political power in its foreign policy, not only in the South Caucasus, but altogether. And while developing or revising, I mean, it should revise its relation with Turkey and change it from the transactional relations into value-based relations. So we have this unfortunate EU-Turkey deal about refugee policies and so on. So we see that EU has developed this transaction relations with Turkey. If it is changes, then you can probably see again Turkey will play back. But I don't know. This is what I have been observing that we should also, you know, focus on.
Thank you, Professor Aydin. Last concluding remark.
Yes, just very briefly. I think the Turkey's, when you go into the identity question in Turkey, it has always been complicated. And it was never purely European or transatlantic, and it's not purely Middle Eastern now. It was always mixture. And when you ask the population in general, the people, public, they were always mixed responses. And even today, I do conduct surveys, public surveys, and I find out, you know, when you ask their primary identities, it's 50-50. 50% European Western and 50% Eastern, Middle Eastern, whatever you like to call it. The difference is 20 years ago or 10 years ago, even the primary talking points coming from the government was more pro-European and transatlantic than more pro-Eastern. Today, it's more emphasis are put on Turkish interest, national interest, regional interest, which includes the Middle Eastern aspect. You know, having said this, I don't see a shortcut to re-Europeanization of Turkey, so to speak. That's the question. That's how it was put in the question. And the primary reason for that is the European attitude and the behavior, the political atmosphere in Europe. In Turkey, in contrast, the political atmosphere is there is no appetite to start anything new. You know, there is no appetite to starting Turkey's rapprochement with Armenia or with Greece. There is no appetite to negotiate anything on Cyprus. There is no appetite to negotiate European connection. The emphasis is maybe it's not only related to Turkey, but in a wider, we can straight this in a wider geopolitical context, that the emphasis in Turkey is now on the interest of Turkey, just like the Trump's emphasis on American interest. So if there is any movement on any of the issues that Turkey is facing with its neighbors or with Europe, the first step has to come from the other side. From domestic political environment in Turkey, there is no, I would say, there is no incentive to try to repair any kind of relations with any kind of neighboring countries. Maybe something related to Eastern Mediterranean. We might expect that changes and some movement there. But apart from that, I don't see any appetite, any movement from Turkish government.
Thank you. Licinia.
just perhaps a brief note on the importance of institutional settings for this sort of cooperation that Professor Aydin was talking about to happen. One of the features of this period is the lack of trust and investment in institutions, either many times domestic institutions with leaderships personalized around an individual, but also in terms of regional institutions and global multilateral institutions. They seem to be of no interest to the current challenges when they in fact are the most valuable resource we have to deal commonly with the challenges we have. So I would, trying to forge a way ahead for Turkey to see an interest in regional dialogues, but also thinking of Russia and this extremely urgent and necessary dialogue that we need between Europe, between Eurasian powers, and this includes, of course, European countries, European institutions, Russia, Turkey, China. We need India. We have a huge continent with important challenges ahead, and I think thinking of institutional platforms and formats where this dialogue can take place is a way of binding these leaderships to common goals that can have a long-term effect. Otherwise, they shift with electoral cycles or changes of opinion. And I would say that this is perhaps the greatest investment we need to make in the coming years, is for strong institutions that can provide and deliver to citizens.
Thank you, Licinia. Ivanna?
Yes, so as the concluding remark, I think I would like to pick up on what Licinia said in terms of the huge importance when looking at the influence of Turkey-Russia relations, especially not only in terms of South Caucasus, but also from the perspective of particular Georgia, as it has been the most, let's say, open and active in different like sub-regional platforms. I think the importance of these sub-regional platforms is extremely important, and Turkey should not lean back in terms of trying not to irritate Russia. So I think Turkey should have a higher profile in the Black Sea security dialogue, and definitely Black Sea security and South Caucasus, they are part of one very important cluster of regional cooperation. So it should be something that Turkey should be paid more attention to. This is one thing. And another thing, I think the sub-regional cooperation here is very important among like all regional states. And especially if we speak about the EU contribution to the South Caucasus, the role of Georgia here is extremely important, because Georgia, being the EAP partner, very active, like high achiever, very active participating country, it has already deserved its legitimate role as part not only like South Caucasus and Black Sea country, but like of Eastern Europe together with Ukraine and Moldova. So it has been kind of already traveling into this very different regional perspective. And I think Georgia should take use of it to also take out South Caucasus in a way from this very so far glued situation. And this is also the avenues maybe that need more research and more kind of inputs. So this would be my remark as well.
Thank you very much, Ivanna. I would like to at the end say that it was very illuminating and very interesting conversation. I learned a lot about the Turkish present foreign policy, and I think we really need this kind of engagement time to time, because sometimes we feel that we are neighbors and we are very close, but things are changing internally or externally in each country. So we need this kind of dialogue and more publications, more research. And I would like to thank Heinrich Boell Foundation for supporting us within this endeavor. And I also would like to thank all the panelists for participation. And as I said, we will have 2 more events, one actually related to the security issues, and another panel will be related to economy and energy sector. So I know that there are a few more questions, but unfortunately we are very far behind of our actually initial schedule. So I would like to apologize to attendees about this. But I hope to see all of you in for next round of our talks, and I hope to see our panelists also very soon, either in Tbilisi or in their capitals. Thank you very much.
Can I briefly add before you all leave that there will be a follow-ups kind of survey, just for the feedback that you could give us, how you found this webinar, how useful it was. You will receive this by email, and we would be grateful if you could just fill in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you
Thank you, Kornely,
for the
invitation.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.